The morning mist hung thick over the small, quiet neighborhood. As the sun began to rise, its rays barely broke through the gray clouds that loomed like an oppressive weight over the streets of Ironbound. The pavement, cracked and worn, bore the scars of years of neglect, much like the people who lived here, hard-working, humble, but weathered by the struggles of life. Among them was Martha Holloway, a woman whose heart was as tough as the cobblestones beneath her feet, but whose soul was softened by love for her family and community. At 70 years old, Martha had seen more than her fair share of hardship. But she was a fighter, fighting for her children when her husband had passed, fighting for her neighbors when the city tried to drive them out, and fighting every single day to make sure the next generation didn't suffer the same fate. Her modest home, a small house tucked between towering, run-down apartment buildings, had always been a sanctuary, a place where she could give her children and grandchildren the love and care they deserved. But lately that sanctuary was under siege, and the battle ahead would be her fiercest yet. Vincent Holloway, her estranged son, had become the enemy. Once a sweet boy who ran barefoot through these very streets, Vincent had left Ironbound years ago, determined to escape its poverty and make something of himself. And he had, becoming the CEO of Holloway Enterprises, a powerful real estate development firm. Now, as the company's president, he was poised to bulldoze through his own childhood home, along with many others, to build what he called a revitalization project, a gleaming new district of luxury apartments and offices. To Vincent, it was an opportunity to secure his legacy, to finally rid himself of the past that held him back. But to Martha and the community, it was an eviction, a betrayal of everything they had fought for. Martha had always feared this day would come. She had watched as the neighborhood slowly transformed over the years, old businesses closing, families moving out, new, wealthier residents moving in, gentrification. But she had hoped, prayed even, that her own son wouldn't be part of this tide of change. That morning, as she made her way to the corner store, she saw Vincent's team setting up on the street corner, a handful of well-dressed men and women carrying blueprints, legal papers, and measuring devices. They were there for her home, for the homes of her neighbors. Martha's heart dropped. She knew what was coming. The city had been talking about it for months, but now it was real. A familiar voice snapped her from her thoughts. It was John, an elderly neighbor who had lived in Ironbound for decades. His face was grim as he approached, shaking his head. "Martha, they're starting today. The bulldozers are coming for us. How much time do we have?" Martha asked, her voice steady but laced with concern. "Not much. Maybe a week, maybe less." "They're moving fast." Vincent's firm had already sent out the eviction notices, but it wasn't just a few families. They were targeting the entire neighborhood. The homes where people like Martha had lived for decades, raised families, built their lives, were now just numbers on a blueprint to Vincent. Martha's fists clenched. She had fought too long to watch it all disappear. But this time, it wasn't just about the neighborhood. It was about her own flesh and blood. She hadn't seen Vincent in years, but she knew what he had become. A businessman, a man who could justify anything for the sake of profit. She had to stop him. That afternoon, Martha decided to pay him a visit. She would confront her son, tell him face to face that his greed had come at the expense of everything she had raised him to value. She walked through the streets of Ironbound, her steps resolute, each one carrying the weight of years of sacrifice and love. As she passed familiar faces, she saw their concern mirrored in her own. Her neighbors had trusted Vincent to look out for them, to help them, not tear their lives apart. At the Holloway Enterprises office, the building was sleek and imposing, a far cry from the dilapidated streets she had grown up on. Martha stood before the towering structure for a moment, her breath coming in short bursts. The lobby was quiet, Too quiet, as if the building itself was waiting for her next move. A receptionist looked up from her desk as Martha approached. "I need to see Vincent Holloway." "Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked, barely glancing up. "No, but I'm his mother." The receptionist faltered, then quickly dialed a number on the phone. A few moments later, she nodded. "You can go up." Martha's heart beat heavily as she entered the elevator. As the doors closed, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirrored walls. A woman who had fought for everything she had, now about to confront her own son. When the doors opened on the top floor, Vincent's assistant greeted her politely but coldly, leading her into an office that seemed far too pristine and sterile. Vincent was sitting behind a massive desk, his back straight, his hands folded neatly. The years had made him harder, more polished, but the eyes, his eyes, still carried a hint of the boy he used to be. "Mom, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice even but tinged with surprise. "I'm here to tell you that you've gone too far." "Vincent," Martha's voice was steady, but the weight of her words carried an intensity that made the air between them feel thick with tension. He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "What are you talking about?" Martha didn't hesitate. "You're taking away the only home I have left, the only home your father worked so hard for. You're taking it all, Vincent, everything." "For what? So you can make a few more million?" Vincent's gaze faltered for a moment, and that was all it took for Martha to see the cracks. But she wouldn't let him off that easy. "This neighborhood, these people, this was our legacy. But you don't care about that anymore, do you? You've forgotten where you came from." Martha stood her ground, waiting for him to speak. Her heart beat heavily, but her resolve was unwavering. Her son had become a stranger, and she was going to fight for the community he was willing to tear apart. Would Vincent continue with his plans? Or would Martha's words break through the hardened businessman he had become? The battle between mother and son had just begun, and Martha would stop at nothing to protect the home she loved. Martha Holloway returned home that evening with the weight of the world pressing on her shoulders. The confrontation with Vincent had been tense, but it had also sparked something in her, an ember of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she could reach her son, or at the very least, make him see what he was about to destroy. As she stepped into her small house, the familiar creak of the wooden floor beneath her feet soothed her, but the comfort of home was bittersweet. The house was modest, but it was hers. Her family had lived here for 3 generations. Every crack in the walls, every piece of old furniture, carried the memories of sacrifice, laughter, and tears. Her children had been raised here, and now it was where her grandchildren came to visit, a place of refuge amid a city that was quickly becoming unfamiliar. Martha's eldest daughter, Emily, was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Emily was in her late 40s, with a similar strength and resilience to Martha. She had inherited her mother's stubborn streak, though Emily's compassion often ran deeper than most could understand. As Martha walked in, Emily turned from the stove with a warm smile. "Mom, how did it go?" Emily asked, her voice gentle yet filled with concern. She wiped her hands on her apron before crossing the room to embrace her mother. The 2 women shared a tight hug, a moment of shared strength. "He's not listening, Emily." Martha's voice cracked slightly, but she forced herself to remain composed. "He's so far removed from the boy I once knew." Emily nodded solemnly, understanding her mother's pain. "I know, he's not the same. But we're not the same people we were either. We've got to fight this, Mom. We've been through worse." The conversation turned briefly to the details of the eviction. Emily had been following the developments and was just as angry as her mother. They both knew the changes that were happening in their neighborhood. The few remaining local businesses were being driven out by wealthy developers. The families who had lived there for decades, people who had worked tirelessly to make ends meet, were facing displacement. Martha's old friends, The neighbors who had shared their stories and struggles over the years were at risk of losing everything. I don't understand him. Emily. Martha's voice was quieter now, full of sorrow. Vincent used to love this place. This is where he learned how to be strong. I taught him to always help those who needed it most. But now he's turning his back on the people who gave him everything. Emily sighed, but there was a fire in her eyes. I don't think he's turned his back on us, Mom. He's just forgotten. We've got to remind him of who he was. The words were comforting, but Martha knew this would be no easy feat. She looked around at the familiar surroundings, the worn couch, the old photographs hanging on the wall, the kitchen table where her family had shared countless meals. Her grandchildren had grown up in these rooms. It wasn't just a house. It was their history, their legacy. That evening, after dinner, Martha went outside to her small garden. The chill of the autumn air felt like a reminder that change was coming, whether she liked it or not. She stood by the old oak tree that had stood in their yard for as long as she could remember, its branches just beginning to shed their leaves. Martha placed her hand on its rough bark, taking comfort in its quiet strength. Her 2 grandchildren, Olivia and Jack, came running outside to join her. Olivia, the older of the 2, was 10 years old. She had her mother's dark eyes and her grandmother's fiery spirit. Jack, at 7, was a bit more reserved but had a heart as big as his grandmother's. "Grandma, can we go to the park tomorrow?" Olivia asked, tugging at Martha's sleeve. Martha smiled, kneeling down to look her granddaughter in the eye. "Of course we can, sweetie. We'll go to the park, and then I'll take you to get some ice cream." Olivia's face lit up, and she ran off to find Jack, who had been quietly watching from the porch. For a moment, Martha watched her grandchildren play, their laughter a soothing balm on her troubled heart. She loved them with all her soul, and she couldn't bear the thought of them losing everything, losing their home, their memories, and the community that had raised them. That night, as she lay in bed, Martha couldn't sleep. The weight of the world pressed on her chest. She thought of the people, the families, who would be displaced if Vincent's project moved forward. She thought of her neighbors who had come to her for support time and time again. These were people who had always given their all, even when they had little. They deserved better than what the city was offering. Martha's thoughts turned to the antagonist's world, Vincent's world. She could see it so clearly now. She had been to his office, seen the polished glass walls, the suits, the world of profit, status, and detachment. A world where people like her, people like the families she had fought for, were nothing but numbers on a spreadsheet. In Vincent's eyes, progress meant money. His plans for Ironbound weren't about helping people. They were about expanding his empire, building luxury apartments, and gentrifying a neighborhood that had once been a thriving community. His detachment was so complete, it was as though the very idea of helping others had become foreign to him. The emotional bond between Martha and her community was growing stronger with each passing day. She would not let them be forgotten. She could already feel the seeds of rebellion stirring within her. Martha had begun to make her plans. The time for talking was over. She would take action. She would fight back, not with anger, but with the very compassion that had defined her life. And she would make sure that Vincent remembered the values he had once held dear, the values he had been raised with. The fight was just beginning, and Martha knew she couldn't win it alone. She had her family, her community, and her unwavering belief in what was right. As she closed her eyes that night, Martha silently made a vow. No matter what it took, she would protect what was theirs. And she would make Vincent see, no matter how hard it was, that even the most hardened hearts could be softened by love. Martha woke up early the next morning, as she often did, to the quiet hum of the city waking up around her. The faint sound of car engines, the distant chatter of people heading to work, and the smell of fresh bread from the corner bakery were all familiar comforts. But today, something felt different. She could feel the weight of the coming storm in the air. Her son's actions had taken root in her thoughts, a seed of betrayal that had planted itself deep in her heart. But Martha was not one to sit idly by. She had raised her children with the knowledge that compassion, not money or status, was what mattered most. And that compassion was something she intended to show to the very end. It was a cool autumn morning when the first act of kindness occurred. Martha was walking down the same worn street she had walked 1,000 times before, the familiar faces of her neighbors greeting her with nods and smiles as she passed. But today, she noticed something different. A girl, no older than 8, standing on the sidewalk near the corner of the street, her clothes ragged and her face streaked with dirt. The girl was holding a small bundle of newspapers, trying desperately to balance them in her tiny hands. Martha's heart clenched when she saw the child struggle under the weight of the papers. She recognized the girl immediately. Sarah, the youngest daughter of a family that had lived in the building next to hers. Her mother had fallen ill a few months ago, and her father was out of work, unable to provide for his family. Martha knew that the girl wasn't selling newspapers out of choice. It was out of necessity. Without thinking twice, Martha crossed the street toward her, her shoes clicking on the cracked pavement. "Sarah, sweetie, what are you doing out here all by yourself?" Martha asked, her voice warm but concerned. Sarah looked up, startled by the familiar voice. Her wide eyes filled with a mix of fear and sadness. "I'm trying to sell these newspapers, Grandma Martha. My mommy needs the money." Martha knelt down, her knees creaking as she crouched to Sarah's level. She reached into her purse and pulled out a few crumpled bills. "Sarah, I know you're trying to help, but this isn't the way." She gently took the papers from the girl's hands and set them aside on the sidewalk. "Why don't you come with me?" Martha said, offering Sarah her hand. "Let's get you something warm to drink, and we'll take care of the rest." For a moment, Sarah hesitated, glancing back at the pile of newspapers. She had been taught to never leave her post. But then, seeing Martha's soft, comforting eyes, she slowly placed her hand in Martha's. "Okay, Grandma." As they walked toward Martha's house, Martha could see the relief in Sarah's posture. The child walked a little taller, her shoulders no longer hunched under the weight of her burden. Once inside, Martha fixed them both a cup of hot cocoa and sat Sarah down at the small kitchen table, just as she had done countless times for her own children and grandchildren. "Thank you for helping me, Grandma Martha," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Martha smiled warmly, brushing a strand of hair from the girl's face. "You don't need to thank me, sweetie. You're a good girl. You're doing your best, and that's all anyone can ask for." But as Martha looked at Sarah, the warmth in her heart was mixed with a growing sense of urgency. She knew that acts of kindness like this one, small, fleeting moments of human connection, were the foundation of a community. The community that Vincent was so willing to tear apart, all in the name of progress. After Sarah had finished her cocoa and Martha had seen her off to her home with a few extra bills in hand, she stood by the door for a moment, watching the girl disappear down the street. Martha's thoughts turned inward. How many other families were struggling just like Sarah's? How many more children were working, hungry, desperate to survive in a world that had long forgotten about them? Later that afternoon, Martha stood at her kitchen window, watching the street outside. She could see the slow trickle of people walking to work, the kids on their bikes, the elderly pushing their walkers to the local store. This was her neighborhood. This was where her people lived, fought, and survived. But the plans Vincent had laid out would wipe it all away, replacing their homes with glass towers and corporate buildings. It was the coldness of his ambition that gnawed at Martha's heart. Where was the compassion in all of this? Where was the humanity? As the day wore on, Martha couldn't shake the image of Sarah's tired eyes. The girl had been forced to grow up too fast, burdened with the responsibility of saving her family. It wasn't fair, and the more Martha thought about it, the more she realized that Vincent's plans weren't just destroying buildings, they were destroying lives. The people in this neighborhood weren't just statistics, they were human beings, and Martha would make sure her son remembered that. She began to plan, though the magnitude of what lay ahead scared her. She wasn't naive enough to think this would be easy, but there was no turning back now. This was her son and her home, her community, and Martha would fight with everything she had. The act of kindness toward Sarah was more than just a fleeting moment of generosity. It was the spark that would ignite Martha's resistance. In helping the girl, Martha realized she wasn't just helping one family. She was taking a stand for every family who had been forgotten. She was making a statement to Vincent and the world around her that these people were not disposable. She would not sit idly by and let them be erased. And so, the fight began, not with anger but with compassion, a single act of kindness that would ripple outward. Martha's actions, her courage, would lead the way. The first wave of resistance had begun, and Martha could already feel the shift. The real battle wasn't just about homes or land, it was about the souls of the people Vincent was ready to discard. And Martha wasn't about to let that happen without a fight. The sun had barely risen when Martha made her decision. The cool autumn air bit at her cheeks as she walked the familiar path to Holloway Enterprises, her heart heavy with a mixture of determination and dread. She had never imagined this moment would come. To face her son, to stand against him, to fight for everything he was so willing to destroy. But as the day approached, Martha knew there was no other choice. The streets of Ironbound were quieter than usual, but each step felt like a march toward something bigger. As she neared the towering glass and steel building that represented Vincent's empire, the weight of what she was about to do hit her. She had spent her life building up this community, a community that meant everything to her, and now she was about to risk everything. Her relationship with her son, her peace of mind, and her legacy, just to protect it. When Martha entered the sleek lobby of Holloway Enterprises, the cold, sterile design made her feel more out of place than she'd ever felt in her life. She approached the reception desk, where a young woman looked up, barely glancing at her. "I need to see Vincent Holloway," Martha said, her voice firm despite the nervous thrum in her chest. "Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked without looking up. "No, but I'm his mother." Martha's words were sharp, as if to make it clear that she wasn't going to be dismissed this time. The receptionist hesitated for a moment, before her fingers danced quickly over the keyboard. A moment later, she nodded. "You can go up. Mr. Holloway is expecting you." Vincent sat behind his polished desk, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the smooth wood. He had been through meetings, presentations, and endless calls with investors. But this was something different. The old woman, standing before him now, was no longer the same fragile mother who had raised him with love. No, she was a woman who had lived a life of hardship and sacrifice. And now, she was standing here as his enemy, as someone who dared to confront him in his world of wealth, power, and ambition. He leaned back in his chair, eyes cold as he watched her approach. She looked older, but the fire in her eyes hadn't dulled. He could see the years of pain and determination etched into her face, and for a moment he felt a fleeting pang of guilt. But it passed quickly, swallowed by the world he had built. A world where the only thing that mattered was success. "Mom." Vincent's voice was casual, almost dismissive, as he gestured for her to sit. "What's this about?" Martha's eyes narrowed as she took a step forward, her feet steady despite the storm swirling in her chest. She had never been afraid of Vincent, not when he was a boy, and certainly not now. But as she stared at him, sitting there in his perfectly pressed suit, the same man who had once called her mom, the years of disappointment caught in her throat. "You know why I'm here." Her voice was low, steady, though there was a tremor of emotion beneath the surface. "I'm here because you've turned your back on everything that matters. You've become a part of something that's hurting this community. Our home, Vincent. The very home you grew up in." Vincent raised an eyebrow, his fingers tapping against the desk as he took in her words. A part of him wanted to argue, to explain the benefits of his project, the revitalization of Ironbound, the new wealth it would bring. But he had heard it all before, from the very people he had left behind. They didn't understand. They couldn't understand. Progress didn't wait for sentiment. "This is the way the world works, Mom." His voice was clipped, controlled. "You know that. You can't hold on to the past forever. We're bringing jobs, growth. This neighborhood will become a better place." "A better place?" Martha's voice rose, filled with emotion. "A better place for whom, Vincent? The rich who will come in and take over, or the families who will be left homeless when you tear down their homes?" Vincent clenched his jaw. This wasn't the conversation he wanted to have. "You're being sentimental, Mom. These people don't own this land. It's a business transaction." Martha shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. "Business transaction? You call that a transaction when you're taking away the only homes these people have ever known? You think you can just bulldoze through our lives for the sake of progress? How much is enough for you, Vincent? When did you stop caring about the people who made you who you are?" The words struck him harder than he expected. For a brief second, he felt the weight of his mother's disappointment pressing down on him, but he pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to feel weak, not now. Not with everything on the line. "Mom, this is how things are. You've raised me to understand that you have to be strong, and this project is part of that strength. You're just not seeing the big picture." "I see it perfectly, Vincent. You're destroying everything you once claimed to care about." Her eyes were burning now, and she wasn't holding back. "You're not the person I raised you to be. You've become someone else. Someone who doesn't care about family, about loyalty, about the people who made your success possible." Vincent stood up from his chair, his posture rigid. He was angry now. His mother had crossed a line, and he didn't know how to stop the words from spilling out. "You don't get it, do you?" he spat. "You raised me to be strong, to take opportunities when they came. But you want me to throw everything away for sentiment? This isn't just about you, it's about what's best for everyone." "No, Vincent, it's about what's best for you." Martha's voice was a fierce whisper. "And if you continue down this path, you'll lose everything that actually matters. You'll have your success, but you'll be alone." A heavy silence settled between them. A silence filled with the weight of everything unspoken. For a moment, Vincent looked at his mother, not the CEO, not the business mogul, but the woman who had sacrificed so much for him. The woman who had given him everything. But that moment was fleeting. The world he had created wouldn't let him turn back. He had come too far. He had too much to lose. Martha could see it in his eyes. He had already made up his mind. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that there was still a piece of the old Vincent in there, the boy who had once cared about family, who had understood the value of community. But now all that was left was a businessman, a man who had traded his heart for power and money. "I'm not going to stop, Mom." Vincent's voice was cold, final. "You can't stop this." Martha took a deep breath, her shoulders sagging under the weight of his words. The truth hit her harder than any blow she had ever received. Her son had changed. He was no longer the boy who used to run through these streets with laughter in his eyes. He had become something else, something she could no longer reach. She turned to leave, but before she reached the door, she paused. One last time she looked back at him. "Then I'll stop you myself." Her voice was quiet but resolute. "You've forgotten where you came from, Vincent. but I won't forget." With that, she walked out of the office, leaving her son to ponder her words and the storm that was about to erupt in the heart of Ironbound. Vincent Holloway stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his office, staring out over the sprawling cityscape of Newark. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the sun sinking slowly behind the skyline, casting long shadows over the streets. From up here, everything looked small, neat, controlled, orderly. Everything Vincent had worked for. The city of opportunity. The future. But as his eyes swept over the iron-gray buildings of Ironbound, something gnawed at him. A discomfort, a growing unease that had lodged itself deep in his chest ever since his mother had confronted him. Her words still echoed in his mind, louder than the meetings or the reports that flooded his desk. "You're not the person I raised you to be." That bitter, quiet accusation had been hard to shake off. He couldn't afford to dwell on it. Progress needed to be made, and it was too late to turn back now. But the thought of what he was doing to his childhood neighborhood, a place he had once called home, kept circling back, uninvited. His mind struggled to suppress it, but the weight of it was there, waiting to be acknowledged. The phone on his desk rang, its shrill tone breaking through his thoughts. He picked it up quickly, eager to focus on the task at hand. Vincent Holloway. "Mr. Holloway." A familiar voice on the other end began. It was Aaron, his assistant, a voice always calm and collected, never revealing any hint of stress. But today her tone was strained. "There's a situation in Ironbound. You need to see this." Martha stood in front of her home, her arms crossed tightly against her chest as she looked down at the street. It had been a difficult few days since her confrontation with Vincent. Her neighbors were beginning to feel the tension too. Rumors of the eviction were spreading quickly, and despite her efforts, the bulldozers were still on their way. But today, it wasn't the legal battles or the development project that would change everything. It was something far more immediate. Martha had received a phone call that morning from Gloria, one of the elderly women who lived down the block. Gloria's shack had caught fire. No one was hurt, but the damage was severe. The small building was little more than charred rubble now, a stark reminder of how fragile everything in Ironbound truly was. People had lost their homes before, but now it felt personal. This wasn't just a statistic. This was someone's home. Someone Martha had known for years, now reduced to ash by a broken system. As Martha stood in the cold wind, watching the firefighters work to salvage what little they could, something snapped inside her. She turned to the group of onlookers who had gathered, including many of her neighbors, and made her decision. "We're not waiting any longer." Martha's voice was sharp, resolute. She marched toward the crowd, rallying them with every step she took. "We will fight this, together." It was time for a public stand. No more silent suffering, no more waiting for Vincent or the city to fix things. Martha wasn't just going to sit back and let this community be erased. The stakes had just become real. At the same moment, Vincent's office was suddenly filled with panic. Aaron's voice crackled through the intercom, cutting through his concentration. "Vincent, you need to see this. It's on the news." Vincent spun around, pressing a button on his desk. The large screen flickered on, showing a live feed from a local news channel. The headline flashed across the screen. "Ironbound Fire Forces Evacuations. Community in Crisis." The reporter's voice filled the room, describing the fire in graphic detail. As the camera panned across the street, Vincent's blood ran cold. The familiar, dilapidated houses he had planned to demolish, were now the backdrop to a disaster. The flames, the smoke, the chaos, it hit him like a punch to the gut. The camera then cut to a figure standing among the crowd. It was Martha. Her face was hard, her eyes fierce, and her voice strong as she addressed the growing crowd of supporters. She was organizing them, rallying them. "We will not be silenced. We will not be erased." The sound of her voice echoed in Vincent's mind. There it was again, the image of his mother, not as a frail old woman, but as a force of nature demanding justice. She wasn't just angry. She was fighting for what she believed in. She wasn't afraid to face the consequences. Vincent's stomach churned. He had seen her angry before, but this was different. This wasn't a protest. This was her stand, a moment of defiance, and that was what troubled him. He had never considered that his mother would be the one to stop him. The weight of this realization hit him like a ton of bricks. What had he done? Had he really considered the impact of his actions? Or had he been so absorbed in his own vision of success that he failed to see the human consequences? He looked back at the fire footage, watching as his mother led her neighbors in defiance, standing firm, not as a victim, but as a warrior for the people who had been forgotten. A moment of doubt crept in. A crack in the armor. Martha's neighbors rallied around her, banding together to help the families who had lost their homes. They started to organize. A community meeting was scheduled for the following evening, with word spreading fast. People were signing petitions, organizing protest walks, and speaking to local reporters. For the first time, Martha felt a surge of hope. Her fight was far from over, but the resistance was growing. She wasn't alone, and neither were her neighbors. Martha couldn't stop the fire from consuming Gloria's home, but she could fight to make sure no more families would lose everything. She could rally the community, make sure they had a voice, a chance to fight back against the gentrification that threatened to erase them all. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision sink in. This was only the beginning. Back in his office, Vincent was lost in thought. The tension in the room was palpable. Aaron stood silently, waiting for him to make a decision. He could see it in Vincent's eyes. The realization was there, but Vincent wasn't ready to admit it. He couldn't. He had a choice to make. Stick with his project, or listen to the people who had been his foundation. To embrace progress and risk losing everything that made him human, or to reconnect with his roots and find another way forward. He turned slowly, looking at the blueprint of Ironbound on his desk. The project had been his dream, but now, with his mother's voice ringing in his ears and the images of Martha's defiance haunting him, it was beginning to feel like a nightmare. The conflict had escalated. He had made his move, but now the emotional toll was taking its first true weight. Martha's stand had shifted everything, forcing him to question his choices in a way he hadn't before. Vincent wasn't ready to back down yet, but the battle lines were drawn, and the emotional stakes were higher than ever. The days after the fire were quiet, too quiet. The chaos had momentarily subsided, but the tension in Ironbound was palpable, hanging thick in the crisp autumn air. Martha had spent her time organizing with the community, working tirelessly to ensure the families displaced by the fire had somewhere to stay. She had also begun preparing for the upcoming public meeting, where she would address the full scope of what Vincent's plans meant for the neighborhood. But despite the flurry of activity, a heaviness weighed on her heart. She could feel the storm on the horizon. The final confrontation she knew was coming. But for now, it was almost like the calm before the chaos, quiet, tense and suspended. At Holloway Enterprises, things weren't much different. Vincent sat at his sleek glass desk, looking out the window toward the city he had come to dominate. But even as he watched the world from his high-rise, a sinking feeling lingered in his chest. The image of his mother's determined face, standing in front of the fire-ravaged remains of Gloria's home, wouldn't leave him. He had seen that look in her eyes before, a look that said she wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted. Her words had echoed in his mind for days now. "You've forgotten where you came from." Vincent had spent years pushing away his past. ignoring the roots he'd tried to outrun. His ambition, his drive for success, had always been his guiding force. It had made him who he was, the successful CEO, the man with the power to change cities. But now his success felt hollow. The quiet realization that his choices had hurt the very people who had once supported him gnawed at his thoughts. He couldn't deny it any longer. The gentrification of Ironbound wasn't just about business. It was about power, and something deep inside him knew it was wrong. Vincent leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. His phone sat on the desk, silent, as though even it could sense the weight of his indecision. He hadn't made a move since the confrontation with his mother. His usual decisiveness had faltered. The paperwork for the project remained in a neat stack beside him, untouched. The contracts, the permits, everything was ready to go. Yet each time he reached for them, a voice inside him hesitated. What if it was too late to fix things? Meanwhile, Martha had her own moments of reflection, walking through the quiet streets of Ironbound. The neighborhood was still in flux, with families trying to rebuild their homes, a few scattered protests happening in between. The community was united, stronger than ever, but something in her heart told her this fight was only beginning. Martha passed by the old bodega where she used to shop, the shopkeeper waving at her from behind the counter. She stopped for a moment, exchanging pleasantries, but her mind was elsewhere. Her thoughts lingered on the people she had grown up with, the families she had fought for, the struggles she had witnessed. When Vincent was a child, this neighborhood was all they had, but now everything felt like it was crumbling. The businesses, the homes, the history of this place. It was all threatened by someone she had once trusted most in the world. Could she win this fight? What would it cost her to take down the man she had once called her son? Over the next few days, Vincent's internal conflict continued to swirl. He tried to keep his mind on business, attending meetings, signing contracts, reviewing plans for the redevelopment. But it wasn't the same. The cold, sterile world of profit he had built seemed empty now. Even the praise from his investors felt hollow, as if they were applauding him for something that wasn't his to claim. The protesters outside his office, the calls from community leaders. Nothing had swayed him before, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He had sacrificed everything for success, but it was clear now that what he had sacrificed wasn't just his connection to his family. It was his connection to his humanity. His thoughts turned to Martha, standing so defiantly in the streets, leading the charge for those who had been forgotten. Could she really be right? Was his pursuit of success worth the cost of everything he had once believed in? Could he balance his vision for the future with the people who had raised him? One evening, after another day of meetings, Vincent found himself walking out to the balcony of his penthouse. The city sprawled below him, lights flickering like stars. He took in a deep breath of the crisp air, his thoughts swirling. What if he could find a way to fix things? What if he didn't have to choose between his vision and his family? Back in Ironbound, Martha found herself standing outside the community hall, the meeting room already buzzing with the voices of the people. She had called the meeting after Gloria's fire, rallying the community to make their voices heard. The small victories, like the donations and legal support she'd managed to secure, had kept the spirits high, but she knew this battle was far from over. Tonight, they would talk about how to take action, how to stand their ground and make their case. The door opened, and Emily stepped out, her face taut with concern. "Mom, I don't know how much longer we can keep this up. They're building the new tower next door, and if Vincent doesn't step in and slow this down, they're going to push us out." Martha's heart sank at the news, but instead of allowing herself to feel defeated, she straightened her back. This wasn't about them. This wasn't just about the neighborhood. This was about protecting the legacy of everything they had built. She walked into the hall, greeted by applause and cheers from the community. They were with her. They believed in her. "We're not going to back down. Not now, not ever. Vincent may have forgotten where he came from, but we haven't. We are ironbound, and we're going to fight for this place until the very end. The night drew on, and Vincent sat in his penthouse, still wrestling with his thoughts. His phone buzzed, an email from his assistant with an update about the Ironbound project. But for once, he didn't reach for the phone immediately. Instead, he stared out the window at the city below, his mind filled with images of his mother, his community, and his own past. Could he find a way to balance the two worlds? Could he go forward with the project without losing everything? As the night wore on, Vincent sat in silence, finally allowing himself to consider the possibility that there was a way out, a way to make things right. The question was, would he have the strength to do it? The calm between the two sides couldn't last forever. The tension was mounting, and the moment of decision was coming. For now, they both rested in a quiet lull. But each of them knew that soon, the storm would come. As Vincent reflected on his past, and Martha continued to rally the community, both were forced to confront what their choices had cost them and what they were willing to sacrifice for the sake of their beliefs. The air was thick with tension as the doors of the community hall swung open. Inside, the room was filled with a mix of familiar faces, residents of Ironbound, people who had lived and struggled together for decades. The long wooden tables were surrounded by the elderly, the young, the working-class families who had once known Vincent Holloway as one of their own. Now, they were all gathered to bear witness to what had become a showdown between a mother's love for her community and her son's ambitious vision for progress. Martha stood at the front, her heart pounding in her chest as the crowd quieted down, awaiting the moment that had been weeks in the making. She had called this meeting, this public confrontation, with the sole purpose of forcing Vincent to face the reality of his actions. She could feel the weight of her decision pressing on her. A legal battle was already underway, but Martha knew that to truly make a difference, Vincent needed to see the faces of the people he had hurt, to hear their voices, to feel the collective force of a community united by love and pain. This wasn't just about saving homes anymore, it was about saving their dignity. Vincent stepped out of his sleek black SUV, the familiar hum of the engine fading as the door slammed shut behind him. He had been ambushed. His public relations team had warned him that this was coming, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of it. Martha's relentless campaign to rally the community had culminated in this moment, a public reckoning. She had already gathered a press team to document every moment, and the media outlets were out in full force, cameras flashing as they positioned themselves outside the community hall. For a man who had built an empire, for someone whose name had been associated with wealth and power, this was a public humiliation that he hadn't anticipated. The idea of facing his past, of confronting the very people he had once known, was terrifying. But what terrified him more was the thought of losing everything: his image, his reputation, his legacy. He could feel the pressure building in his chest as he made his way toward the hall. "You don't have to do this." Erin, his assistant, tried to stop him, her voice tinged with desperation. But Vincent was resolute. "I have to." He turned to face her, his expression hardening. "I can fix this. I'll fix it, no matter what." Inside the hall, Martha stood by the podium, her gaze scanning the room. The faces of her neighbors were filled with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. The chairs were filled with the elders, who had lived through struggles far greater than this. The mothers, holding their children close, their eyes filled with hope, and the young adults, determined to fight for their right to live in the community that had shaped them. The local reporters were scattered around, some setting up cameras, others scribbling notes. They knew this story would make headlines, but they didn't know how it would unfold. Martha felt a brief pang of uncertainty. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, but now that it was here, her resolve was stronger than ever. She had spent her whole life in this community, raised her children here, and now she was prepared to defend it with everything she had. The door at the back of the room opened, and a hush fell over the crowd as Vincent stepped in. His presence was imposing, even though the suit he wore now seemed out of place here. His hair was neatly combed, his face expressionless, as though he could still command the room with just his stature. But the tension in the air clung to him, and the whispers in the crowd were impossible to ignore. Vincent made his way to the front of the room, where Martha stood, her gaze unwavering. For a moment he felt the heat of her gaze, a silent accusation that rattled him in a way he hadn't expected. She wasn't just his mother anymore. She was his opponent. He stood behind the podium, meeting the eyes of the audience. His voice, usually smooth and authoritative, now trembled slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen of Ironbound," he began, his tone formal but strained. "I'm here today to listen to your concerns. I know that change can be difficult, but I believe this project is in the best interest of this city. We have a chance to revitalize Ironbound, to bring it into the future. This neighborhood has been neglected for far too long." Martha's hand clenched around the edges of the podium. She was holding back the surge of anger rising inside her, but she had to wait. This wasn't just about emotion. This was about showing the world who Vincent Holloway had become. "This is not about progress," she interrupted, her voice cutting through the room. The crowd was silent, hanging on her every word. "This is about power. You are not bringing progress, Vincent. You're bringing destruction. You're tearing apart everything that makes this community worth fighting for." The tension in the room escalated. Vincent's facade cracked, the veneer of control slipping as Martha's words pierced through him. He had been prepared for this. He had rehearsed the speeches, the talking points, the promises of compensation. But Martha, his mother, was not here for empty promises. She was here to hold him accountable, and the people who had once supported him were listening, waiting for him to respond. "Mom, you don't understand." Vincent's voice wavered now, his confidence faltering. "This isn't just about the people who live here now. This is about the future. The city needs this." Martha stepped forward, her face hard as stone. "What about the future for them, Vincent? The people who built this neighborhood? The families who have lived here for generations? Do you think they don't have a right to the future, too?" The emotional stakes were higher than ever. Vincent could see it now. His actions weren't just about business. They were about human lives, and for the first time, he couldn't ignore the faces in front of him. He could feel their eyes on him, each one filled with a different emotion: anger, hope, disillusionment. For a moment, it seemed as though Vincent might crumble under the weight of the public exposure. The people had shown him their truth, but he couldn't afford to show weakness. He couldn't afford to let this unravel in front of the world. He took a deep breath, his voice now more controlled, though still tinged with frustration. "I'm not here to apologize. Mom." He looked directly at Martha, his eyes cold now, the familiar defensiveness creeping back in. "I've made my decisions. This is happening whether you like it or not." Martha's heart sank. She knew in that moment that this wasn't just a battle for land. This was a battle for his soul. But there was something different in the air now. A shift. The crowd had begun to murmur, their patience with Vincent slipping away. The truth was out, and the world was watching. The emotional reckoning had begun, and Vincent knew, deep down, that his image, his power, was at risk. The days following the public reckoning were filled with tension, but a new sense of uncertainty hung in the air. Vincent had been forced to confront his actions in front of the people he had once called family. But something inside him had shifted. The image of Martha's face, her steadfast resolve, had not left him. Neither had the faces of the people in the crowd. The old men, the mothers, the children, their hope, their anger, their fear, all directed at him. For years, Vincent had seen success as the ultimate goal. It had been about money, power, and legacy. About building an empire that stood above everything else. But after the meeting, after the reporters' questions and the public's judgment, he began to see things differently. The world he had been so focused on was no longer the world he wanted to be a part of. The vision he had once championed now felt like a prison. It wasn't an overnight change, but the cracks in his carefully built facade were starting to show. In the days that followed the meeting, Vincent began to re-examine his choices. The community meetings he had once dismissed as a nuisance were now a place of reflection. He found himself attending them in the evenings, sitting in the back of the room, listening. No longer the powerful businessman behind a desk, he was just Vincent, a man who had to reckon with his past. Martha, for her part, had mixed feelings. The streets of Ironbound were still filled with unrest, though she had seen small changes. More families were coming together, speaking out against the project. Some of the businesses had been given temporary reprieves, and though she still didn't trust Vincent, she couldn't deny that something in him had begun to shift. Her thoughts, however, were still clouded with doubt. Could Vincent really change? Could he truly understand the weight of his actions and the consequences they had on his family, his community, or was it too late? It was one rainy evening when Martha received the phone call. "Mom, Vincent's here." Emily's voice on the other end was tentative, unsure. "What does he want?" Martha asked, her voice hard, though a small part of her already knew. "He wants to talk. He's asking for a chance to explain." Martha hesitated. The wounds were fresh, the trust still broken. But she had always believed that people could change, that redemption was possible. It was hard to reconcile the idea of forgiving her son. But for the sake of Ironbound, for the sake of the families who had been affected, she had to consider it. "Fine. Tell him to come over." Vincent arrived at Martha's home later that evening, a slight tremor in his step, as though he too was unsure of what to expect. He hadn't been in this neighborhood in years. His own house, now a reflection of the life he had built, seemed a world away from this place, with its cracked sidewalks and small, aging homes. The door creaked open as Martha stood in the entryway, her arms crossed tightly. She didn't invite him in, but neither did she turn him away. Vincent met her gaze, hesitant but determined, his usual confidence absent. "Mom, He paused, looking at the floor before lifting his eyes to meet hers. "I know I can't undo what I've done. I've hurt a lot of people, and I've hurt you." Martha remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "The project, I thought I was doing what was best for the city." Vincent's voice faltered, and for the first time in a long while, he seemed like the young man she had raised, searching for validation. "I thought this was progress, but I didn't think about the people here. The ones who built this neighborhood. The ones who trusted me." Martha's heart clenched. The words were not enough. They could never be enough to undo the damage he had done. But there was something different in his voice. Something she hadn't heard in years. Remorse. I can't change what I've done, Mom. But I want to make it right." Vincent's voice cracked slightly. "I'll stop the project. We can't move forward without more input from the community. I'll help fund the repairs for the families that were displaced. I'll work with local businesses to ensure they're protected." Martha stood still, her arms still crossed, but now her fingers had loosened their grip. She wasn't ready to forgive him, not yet. But she could see that something had changed in him, that glimmer of humanity she hadn't seen in years. "I don't know if that's enough." "Vincent." Martha's voice was calm, measured, but her eyes betrayed the storm inside her. "You've caused a lot of damage. Too much to just fix with money." "I know." Vincent's shoulders sagged, the weight of his own guilt bearing down on him. "I can't expect you to forgive me, Mom. I don't deserve it. But I want to make things right. I don't know where to start, but I'll start with the community, with you." For a moment, Martha stood in silence, the rain tapping softly on the windows behind them. She could feel the years of resentment in her chest, the bitterness of his choices. But somewhere in the back of her mind, something shifted. Maybe it wasn't too late for him to change. Maybe it wasn't too late for Ironbound. "I don't know if you can fix everything, Vincent." Martha finally spoke, her voice softer than it had been. "But this is a good start. Just don't think that one apology will make everything better. You're going to have to prove it." Vincent nodded, his eyes downcast. "I will, I promise." The next few weeks were filled with small victories. The community began to rally together. More donations came in for the families affected by the fire, and business owners who had once been at risk of losing their stores were now finding ways to negotiate with the city. Vincent made it clear that he would fund the repairs for those affected and ensure local businesses were given incentives to stay. The project, though not fully halted, was put on indefinite pause until a new, community-based proposal could be drawn up. While it wasn't a complete resolution, the shift was undeniable. The tension that had hung over the neighborhood for so long began to ease, and Martha felt for the first time that there was a possibility for healing. On a late evening, as Vincent walked out of the community hall after a meeting with local leaders, he glanced across the street at Martha and Emily, who stood together with a group of neighbors. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had taken the first step toward doing something right, but he also knew that the road ahead would be difficult. Too difficult. Martha and Vincent exchanged a quiet glance across the street. Neither of them spoke, but the connection was there, subtle but real. It wasn't a resolution, and it wasn't an apology that could fix everything. But it was a step forward, for both of them, and for Ironbound. As the rain continued to fall, Vincent stood still for a moment. The weight of the past had not been erased, but for the first time in years, he felt like he might be on the path to redemption. But that journey, he knew, had only just begun. The streets of Ironbound were quieter than they had been in months. The usual buzz of busy families hurrying to work and children racing along the sidewalks was still there. But now there was an undercurrent of hope in the air, something that had been missing for far too long. The tension that had once gripped the community had slowly begun to fade. Martha walked through the streets, her heart lighter than it had been in months. Vincent's promise to halt the redevelopment and focus on a new plan that would benefit the community wasn't perfect. But it had sparked something in the people of Ironbound, a renewed sense of purpose, a sense that they hadn't been forgotten. Martha had spent her days working with her neighbors to rebuild what had been lost, repairing homes, ensuring that the families displaced by the fire had a roof over their heads, and keeping the pressure on to make sure that Vincent's promises were upheld. Small victories had begun to add up. Local businesses were receiving support, and the city had agreed to fund a community center where people could come together and continue their fight for a better future. Despite the positive changes, Martha knew this wasn't over. Vincent's redevelopment project hadn't disappeared entirely. It had simply been put on pause for now, a step in the right direction, but the battle for Ironbound's future was far from won. Vincent sat at his desk, his mind still preoccupied with the ongoing negotiations. The previous weeks had been filled with long hours and intense discussions. The community-based plan was finally taking shape, and while he had initially hesitated to support it, he had come to understand something fundamental. This project, this fight, wasn't just about building buildings. It was about building lives, about restoring dignity to the people who had supported him in the past. Even when he had turned his back on them, for the first time, Vincent saw himself not as the CEO of Holloway Enterprises, but as a man with a responsibility to those who had shaped him. The community of Ironbound, with its hardships and triumphs, was now part of his legacy, and he was no longer willing to sacrifice them for his own gain. As he stared out the window of his office, his thoughts shifted to Martha. She had forced him to confront himself, to recognize the human cost of his ambition. She had made him question his choices, not just the project, but the kind of man he had become. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew the road ahead would be difficult. But at least now, he could see a way forward. A few days later, Martha stood in front of her home, looking out at the neighborhood that had begun to rebuild itself. There was still work to be done, but the spirit of the community had returned. The houses were still standing, and the people who lived in them were fighting for their place in the world, not just for themselves, but for the generations that would come after them. Martha turned as Emily walked up to her side, the two women standing together in silence. They watched as a group of neighbors worked together to repaint a house, the bright colors reflecting the fresh sense of renewal in the air. Emily smiled, taking her mother's hand. "It's happening, Mom. We're starting over, together." Martha nodded, her eyes soft with emotion. "Yes, we are, but we couldn't have done this without your father's sacrifice, and without everyone's fight." She paused, looking over to where Vincent was standing with the community members, deep in conversation. And without Vincent's change. Emily followed her mother's gaze, a slight frown appearing on her face. "Do you really think he's changed?" Martha sighed, a distant look in her eyes. "I don't know, Emily. I can't say that I fully forgive him. But I can see that he's trying, and maybe that's all we can ask for." Across the street, Vincent stood with a group of community leaders, discussing the details of the new development plan. It was a plan that emphasized affordable housing, local business support, and community input. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. As Vincent turned to leave, he caught sight of Martha watching him from the porch. For a moment their eyes met, and there was an understanding between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the distance they had come, both as individuals and as a family. Vincent walked toward her, his steps hesitant but purposeful. He stood on the steps, looking up at her, the years of tension between them still present, but lessening with each passing moment. "Mom, I want to thank you," Vincent said, his voice more vulnerable than it had ever been before, "for not giving up on me." Martha met his gaze, her face softening. "I never gave up on you, Vincent. I gave up on what you were becoming. But I always believed you could find your way back." Vincent smiled, the weight of his past decisions still heavy on his shoulders, but the burden of his guilt lifting slightly. "I'm still working on it. But I'm trying, and I'll keep trying." The final days of the project were spent making the necessary adjustments. Vincent worked closely with the community leaders, listening to their concerns and incorporating their input into the redevelopment plan. Slowly, Ironbound began to take shape, not as a luxury district, but as a community that would preserve the past while embracing the future. Martha, too, found herself changing in ways she hadn't expected. She had let go of her anger toward Vincent, realizing that while his actions could never be undone, the change he had shown was a step in the right direction. As they sat together on the steps of her house one evening, watching the sunset, Martha turned to Vincent with a soft smile. "This place, your legacy, it's no longer about the buildings, Vincent. It's about the people, about the lives you've touched, and the lives you've helped restore. That's the real measure of success." Vincent nodded, his eyes reflecting a new understanding. "I've spent so much time focused on the wrong things, Mom. But now, I see." The community of Ironbound had begun to heal, with small steps leading to larger changes. The new development plan would provide much-needed affordable housing, business incentives, and community resources, not just for the wealthy, but for the families who had called Ironbound home for generations. As the project moved forward, Vincent's legacy was no longer shaped by power or profit. It was shaped by his compassion, by his willingness to listen to those he had once ignored, and by the community that had fought for its future. Years had passed since the winds of change had blown through Ironbound, yet the scars of the past still lingered. The newly developed buildings, gleaming and modern, stood proudly in stark contrast to the aging, weathered structures they replaced. But Ironbound was not defined by its new skyline. It was defined by the people who had fought to preserve its soul. Vincent Holloway stood on the edge of the old neighborhood, staring at the new apartment complexes that now dotted the streets. They weren't just luxury high-rises. No, they were homes. Homes for families like his own. Families who had lived here for generations. And as he gazed across the revitalized neighborhood, something deep inside him shifted once more. He wasn't looking at the project he had once seen as a business opportunity. He was looking at a community that was now thriving, a community that had found its footing, not in wealth, but in compassion. It hadn't been an easy journey. At first, the road to redemption had been long and uncertain. Martha's fight had sparked something in him, something he hadn't realized he had lost, the human connection that had shaped him as a child. But after the protests, after the meetings, and after the painful public reckoning, Vincent had come to understand that true progress wasn't about building new things. It was about building relationships. The new housing project, now under full swing, wasn't just about providing shelter. It was about empowering the people who had once been forgotten. Affordable housing was just the beginning. Local businesses that had once been driven out by rising rents were being given protection and incentives to thrive. Community centers and public spaces were designed with input from the very people who lived there, ensuring that their voices were heard every step of the way. And as for Martha, the grandmother who had never once stopped believing in the power of love and community, her legacy was carved into the very streets she had fought to protect. She had become more than just a voice for Ironbound. She had become its heart. And while she still carried the weight of her past decisions, the burden was lighter now. It was a bright morning when Martha and Vincent stood together in front of the newly opened Ironbound Community Center. The center was a symbol of everything they had fought for, a place where families could gather, children could play, and neighbors could find the support they needed. Vincent had pledged the funding for its construction, an investment not in concrete and steel, but in the future of the community. "You've done it, Vincent," Martha said, a proud smile crossing her face as she looked around at the bustling center. Families were already inside, signing up for after-school programs, community workshops, and support services. "We've done it, Mom," Vincent corrected her softly, the warmth in his voice unmistakable. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Martha placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the weight of the years in his words. "I've always believed in you. You just needed to find your way back." Vincent smiled, a genuine smile that spoke volumes of the man he had become. The once cold businessman was now a man of purpose, someone who cared about the impact he had on others, not just the profits. He had made his mistakes, but he had also taken responsibility for them, and in doing so, had shaped a future that would benefit generations to come. As the day wore on, Martha and Vincent found themselves sitting on a bench outside the community center, watching the children playing in the park. The neighborhood was alive again. The streets, once marked by neglect, now teemed with activity. People were smiling, talking, and helping one another in a way that had been absent for far too long. Vincent took a deep breath, turning to his mother. "You know, I used to think that my legacy would be in the projects I built, the skyscrapers I constructed." He paused, glancing at the faces around them. "But I see now that it's here, in these people, in the way they've come together to rebuild this place." Martha nodded, the corners of her eyes crinkling as she smiled. "It's not just about what you build, Vincent. It's about who you help, who you lift up. And I think I've learned that the hard way." Vincent's voice dropped, and for a moment, The weight of his past mistakes seemed to settle back into his shoulders. But then he looked at the community that was beginning to flourish, and his heart lightened. I won't forget this again. Not ever. As the sun began to set, Martha and Vincent sat in comfortable silence, their shared memories of the past merging with the hopeful future they had built together. The world around them was changing, yes, but it was changing for the better. It was a moment of peace, the kind that comes only after a long battle, the kind that comes only after making peace with the past. Ironbound had been given a new chance, and so had Vincent. Martha looked up at her son, the man he had become, filling her heart with pride. You found your way, Vincent, and Ironbound's found its way too. We found it together, Vincent replied, his voice thick with emotion. Martha smiled, knowing the road ahead wouldn't be without its challenges, but she also knew that the foundation had been set for something real, something lasting. The legacy of Ironbound was no longer about wealth or power. It was about human connection, community, and the compassion that had rebuilt it all. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Martha and Vincent stood together, side by side, gazing out over the neighborhood they had fought for. The streets, now vibrant with life, were a testament to the power of change, the power of love, forgiveness, and growth. You know, Mom, I think this place is going to be all right. Martha looked at him, her heart swelling with pride. I think it will be too, Vincent. I think it will be too. The long-term impact of their journey was clear. Ironbound was thriving, and Vincent's legacy had been transformed, no longer defined by his wealth or business empire, but by his compassion and his willingness to change. The community, once at risk of being forgotten, had been given a second chance to grow and prosper. In the quiet of the evening, Martha turned to Vincent once more. Maybe we don't have control over everything, but we do have control over the kind of people we choose to be. And today, we chose to be better. Vincent smiled, the weight of his redemption now a comforting presence in his heart. Yes, Mom. Today, we chose to be better. As you reflect on this story, ask yourself, what kind of legacy do you want to leave behind? In a world driven by ambition and success, it's easy to forget what really matters. But as we've seen in this journey, it's compassion, empathy, and the willingness to change that truly define us. Let your actions shape a better world, one where kindness and understanding guide our decisions, and where our relationships with others become the foundation of our success.